Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. Today, I'll be talking about ecology in science fiction, with a particular focus on something that is seen in a lot of science fiction without necessarily being named as such, and that is ecological succession. I will also be talking about nutrient cycling a bit, primarily because I want to focus on how these two tropes are discussed in the classic Dune, which is, of course, a deserved classic in science fiction, and it is probably the most ecological of all science fiction masterpieces out there. I believe that ecology is a very important part of world building. So if you want to build worlds from scratch, especially if you're a sci-fi author, or if you want to dissect your favorite sci-fi literature and look at the nitty-gritty of the environment and how the people, the characters, and various organisms in that science fiction text are interacting with that environment, then it would be good to know a bit about basic ecology and how it works in the world. Ecology is the study of the interrelationships between organisms and their environment. So it's not enough to just look at one organism in isolation. When you look at the organism in relation to other organisms and to their immediate environment, that is what you call ecology. So with just that definition, you can imagine how important it is for you to be informed of at least a bit of the basics of that when you're writing a science fiction text, because science fiction should be grounded in proper science. And a lot of authors of sci-fi are, very cognizant and very aware of this responsibility of being ecologically sound in a lot of their works without really necessarily going to the hard science of ecology. Now, ecological community succession is one of the most fascinating things in ecology. When we talk about a community, this is a group of organisms of different species living together. A coral reef is a perfect example because you have various species of corals, various species of fish, various species of invertebrates all living together. A tropical rainforest community where you have various species of trees, of shrubs, of herbs, various species of insects and mammals and reptiles and all sorts of animals. These are very good examples of community. When you talk about community succession, you talk about the process that a community goes through from the very beginning to the very end. So let's talk about those beginnings and ends. That's going to be important in defining really what succession is. When you have a barren landscape where there is no life at all, there is the possibility of life eventually forming there. Whether from propagules, like seeds that have been dormant under the ground, such as after a major disturbance, like a glacier or a forest fire. That is what you call secondary succession. But if the landscape has never had life in it and there's no dormant life under the soil or anywhere in that area, then primary succession could be possible. For instance, if animals carry the seeds of plants onto that piece of land, or wind or water could bring those materials, that is what you call primary succession. And so at the start of succession, the environment is typically harsh. It's not really fit for a lot of living organisms. So it has to be prepared somehow for various organisms to be able to thrive in it. That is the responsibility of what we call pioneer organisms. Pioneer organisms or pioneer species are the first to settle on a barren landscape, and they are the ones that will prepare that environment for future organisms. Typically, these are very simple organisms, like for example, microbes, bacteria, fungi, or you can have very simple plants, like non-vascular plants, mosses, and also lichen. These are all organisms that tend to be very tough, very fast-growing, and those are typical characteristics of pioneer species. They reproduce very quickly and produce a lot of young, which is a good modification or adaptation that allows them to overcome very harsh conditions, which typically characterizes an environment that hasn't had life in it. These pioneer organisms, by virtue of growing on the soil, on the substrate, will break down the rock, fertilize it. When they die, they will add their nutrients to the environment, like nitrogen, which is a very, very important element. They will uh, allow more water flow into the environment through their physiological activities. And all of those things will pave the way for other species to eventually take over. So yes, the pioneer organisms start it all off, and then eventually they will get replaced by other species, by uh, secondary, tertiary species in the process of succession. And these are usually larger plants like shrubs and herbs. Take note that we haven't mentioned animals. It's all been plants or microorganisms. Typically, animals are not part of a community succession, but they may have important roles. For instance, as carriers of the propagules. But typically, when we talk about succession, we are talking about the process that involves plants and some microorganisms. So here, when we get to the secondary and tertiary stages, we're talking about some small plants like shrubs and herbs, and they will persist for some time, but eventually they will get replaced by larger and larger plants. And if you're talking about a forest succession, eventually these shrubs will be dominated, not replaced, they will still be there, but they will eventually be dominated by large trees. And these trees will become dominant, meaning that they will outnumber in abundance the rest of the plants. And this would tell us that this particular community has already reached the stage called the climax stage. Now, the climax stage of a community is where there are few dominant species, usually trees, and this is the state that the community will stay in for a very, very long period of time until a major disturbance disrupts the community and usually sets it back to zero. A disturbance is any discrete event that will kill off individuals in a community and will usually reset the community back to zero. So you have flooding, forest fires as typical natural examples of these major disturbances that can reset communities. Artificially, you have, well, artificial grazing or forest fires also, but also oil spills potentially doing that. So these can be very destructive. But if they are natural succession mechanisms, these disturbances can reset the community and either cause the same processes that had gone on before to go on again, or it could be a completely different assemblage of species. So why is this important in science fiction? Have you heard of the term terraforming? Terraforming is converting a non-living landscape into a living landscape, a landscape that can sustain life. Typically, when we talk about terraforming, of course, we're talking about converting something to a place that's livable by humans. We've had many dreams of terraforming Mars and several other planets, or the moon, or several other moons in our solar system. The idea of terraforming really uses as its core principles the principles of community succession. Because when you want to tame a harsh landscape that has never had life in it, or in the case of Mars, has had life in it, but millions and millions of years ago, then you have to start from scratch. You have to start from very simple, tough organisms that will prepare that land for other organisms. On Mars, it's going to be much more complicated because it doesn't have an atmosphere. It has very different environmental factors like the pressure and the gravity, and of course the amount of oxygen. So as scientists have speculated, terraforming that planet would involve a lot of logistics and of course a lot of money. It would involve hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. It's all very exciting. You'd have to do it in domes first, in closed domes. You cannot grow any pioneer organism from Earth outside in the environment of Mars, unless probably they've been genetically engineered to be able to tolerate the very, very harsh conditions of Mars. Otherwise, and that would be very expensive, so otherwise, you'd have to do it in enclosures first, like greenhouses. And once the lichen, the moss, the bacteria from Earth have done their thing on the soil of Mars, then that soil will probably be ready to house more complex plant forms. And eventually, these plants can be grown outside those domes, but the terraforming of Mars isn't that simple. It would have to involve many other mechanisms. For instance, there is the question of not having an atmosphere and there not having enough oxygen. So somehow we have to deal with that. A lot of scientists have speculated that to be able to do that, we have to create a carbon dioxide explosion of sorts on the planet. If here on Earth we're trying to curb our carbon dioxide usage, we're trying to lessen it because of the global warming effects that it has had. On Mars, it's going to be the complete opposite. We have to bombard Mars with the Mars atmosphere with a lot of carbon dioxide. So a lot of proposals have said that we have to build mega factories that will spew out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere of Mars. There are even proposals which will use giant space mirrors to melt the polar ice caps of Mars because these contain carbon dioxide. And the final result will be the release of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, thus creating a layer of gases, thus kickstarting the carbon cycle. And from there, the hydrogen cycle will also start because you have an atmosphere already. So there will be deposition of water and evaporation, creating that hydrogen cycle. In terms of introducing the oxygen, of course, the plants will do that. The plants will be getting that carbon dioxide and they'll be spewing out through photosynthesis the oxygen. There will never really be enough oxygen on Mars to allow us to live there without assistance, most likely. The projections are that we will still have to use some sort of respirator or scuba gear when we go out into Mars, coming out of our homes there. And also one projection is that eventually, whatever we do, Mars will lose its atmosphere again. So that has to be kept in mind if we are to seriously take into consideration the colonization of Mars. So as you can see here, it's all very fascinating. There's so many amazing things that have to be done to be able to terraform Mars. But at the core of it is the idea of community succession, where you have pioneer organisms preparing the landscape for more complicated organisms until we are able to grow veritable forests on Mars. Now, if you've read Dune, then all of this would sound familiar. Because on Arrakis, which is a very, very dry planet, the Fremen and the Kynes family has been really trying to make it a living planet again. And the way they've been doing that is through terraforming based on the principles of community succession. You need only read the appendix on the ecology of Dune at the back of at the end of the novel to be able to see a quite detailed description of what types of pioneer organisms were being used by Kynes, and then what animals were being used from Earth to be able to supplement these processes. The thing about Arrakis is it's a wake-up call. It's actually a warning that if we don't regulate our use of water and our conversion of natural biomes into unnatural biomes, are drying up, and the certification of different biomes, then we might end up becoming like Arrakis. Having said that, Arrakis is the way it is in large part because of one of the most fascinating sci-fi creatures out there, which is the Shai-Hulud, or the sandworm, which is its own character in the universe of Dune. So we can't discuss ecology of Dune without discussing sandworms, even for just a bit, especially because of their very peculiar role in the ecosystem. They're peculiar, first of all, anatomically because they're overly large. If they were creatures on Earth, they wouldn't survive for very long because they'd be too heavy, because they're so massive, and their weight will not be supported by the land. And they're purely terrestrial. They're supposed to be purely terrestrial. Now, the other peculiar thing about them is their role in ecology. Typically on Earth, the primary producers, the ones that consume or use carbon dioxide and sunlight to be able to produce food that other organisms use, are plants. But here in Arrakis, where there are virtually no plants, or very, very few natural plants, the sandworm is its own producer also. It is both primary producer and consumer. Now, how does it do that? How does an animal become a primary producer? Does it photosynthesize? On Earth, there are some animals that photosynthesize to a limited extent, not naturally, but because they consume algae and then they do not digest the chloroplasts. This is typical of some sea slugs, which appear green. But of course, they still rely on food. They cannot rely completely on photosynthesis for survival. Sandworms do not photosynthesize. However, they do produce a lot of methane and produce oxygen in a particular physiological process that they have in their guts. We can assume that this is a type of chemosynthesis, probably. The type of autotrophism or primary production that does not rely on sunlight and carbon dioxide. Instead, this is the one that we find in the deep sea environments. So it's more probably that, and sandworms probably have a lot of microorganisms in their guts that allow them to do this. Bear in mind that sandworms are actually an invasive species on Arrakis. They are not native to Arrakis. You would find this out in later books where it is explicitly mentioned that the sandworm was imported from another planet. This is very interesting from an ecological perspective because on Earth, invasive species are one of the most significant problems on the environment and on biodiversity. Invasive species are species of organisms, most of which are animals, but many of which are also plants and even bacteria and viruses that are found where they're not supposed to be found. They're not naturally found there, but they've been transported, usually by human activity. Invasive species disrupt ecosystems because they're not supposed to be there. They don't have natural predators or competitors. They tend to grow very quickly. They tend to be opportunistic in their feeding, so they eat practically everything. So they steal the niches of native species. That's the thing about invasive species. We don't know what the sandworm stole the niche from when it was transported into Arrakis, but it probably stole more than one niche, given that it's now the dominant life form on Arrakis. And it's said that its biological activity, the way it utilizes spice, and the way it burrows into the ground has all led to the desertification of Arrakis. And that's because the process of it forming spice involves it encapsulating or sequestering water. So there's water under the ground in pockets, and that's where the sandworms create the spice. But on the surface, it's very, very dry. And that's the result of the invasion of the sandworm, which is another cautionary tale. So Dune is a cautionary tale in terms of desertification based on human activity, but also what an invasive species can do. So really, if you want to learn about ecology, not from a science textbook, but from a science fiction text, Dune is a very good place to start. So those are just a few things about ecology in science fiction. Of course, that's a very, very large, very, very broad topic on which we can talk about a lot of things. And I hope that in future episodes, I'll be able to do that. But for now, we were able to discuss community succession and the role of the sandworm in some form of nutrient cycling, particularly in primary production. And I hope that this episode made you think of the ecology of various alien life forms, but also made you want to read Dune by Frank Herbert if you haven't yet. Make sure to do that before the movie comes out in October 2021. We all hope that it's going to be a great, great movie. It's probably going to be the Lord of the Rings of sci-fi. Very epic and grand and excellent, with an excellent cast, right? So who's not excited about that? If you like that video and you would like to see more that touch on popular culture and science and everything in between, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content. See you again next time.